Hi, everybody. I'm Nate Eaton with EastIdahoNews.com, chatting on Zoom with Dave Cawley. He is the host of the Cold podcast with KSL. You've probably heard it. It premiered how long ago, Dave, now?
November of 2018.
2018. It's about the Susan Powell case, Josh Powell and their children and their family. And it was the first eye-opening expose on the entire thing, a really fascinating, well-told story and podcast. And there is some news that's come out in the past week or so about the case. Dave, can you just fill us in on why don't we set the level first? For those people that haven't followed the case, just give us a basic summary of what the story's about.
Yeah, you bet. So this is it's a family drama, it's a crime drama, it's a story about domestic abuse. This all begins in December of 2009 when a woman named Susan Powell, who was a mother of two boys, Charlie and Braden, disappeared. In fact, the entire family, including her husband Josh, just vanished on one Monday morning, snowy Monday morning down in West Valley City, Utah. Police got involved pretty quickly based on some concerned calls from a daycare provider and family members. They went into the Powell family home. Nobody was there. And that afternoon, Josh Powell returns home with his boys. No Susan, claims to have no knowledge of where she is. That kicks off an investigation that spans better part of 2 years, searches all across the western United States. And it reaches a horrible conclusion when on February 5th of 2012, Josh Powell, who had then moved to Washington, killed himself and his sons, Charlie and Braden, on a court-authorized visit. The boys had been taken into state protective custody for some other reasons I'm sure we'll get into. He attacked them with a hatchet, set fire to the house where he was supposed to do this visitation. And from that point going forward, the case went cold. Susan has never been found, but her family fought in the courts for years for the right to claim that social workers who had cared for Charlie and Braden during that period of time had basically been negligent, that they put reunification of Josh with his sons ahead of the safety of the boys, and that ultimately led to a trial that just came to an end.
The cold series starts even before Josh and Susan got married. I mean, this was going back in time, and then it lays out the case. And the episode that I won't forget because it was infuriating and just tragic is that day that the social worker dropped off the kids with their father and called 911. And you got the calls, the 911 calls, the dispatch recordings. I mean, it is chilling to listen to that entire encounter.
It's so hard, and you have this reaction as a person who listens to it, especially if you spent the time with the podcast, getting to know these people, knowing that something horrible is about to happen. Elizabeth Griffin Hall, the woman who dropped the boys off that day, she's a contractor. She's the visitation supervisor. And these two little boys run ahead of her, excited to see their dad. And she's one step behind, and he slams the door in her face, locks her out. And then she dials 911, not knowing what she should do. And she's telling the dispatcher that she can hear a child crying, that she can smell gasoline. And the first responders are slow to get there. They're having trouble finding the address. And you hear all that in that tape. I can tell you, putting together an hour-long episode focusing on the murders of two children was something I knew was going to be part of this project from the outset. And it was, quite frankly, a task that I personally was dreading because of just how awful it is. But a lot of what I tried to do with the podcast was also tell the stories of all the people who are affected. And so you get to hear from family members, from investigators, from members of the community who were touched by this tragedy and how they responded to it.
And the new news that's come out recently is the grandparents sued, was it the state of Washington, for how this was handled? And
Yes.
What was the outcome of that, Dave?
This was a really interesting trial. It actually started back in February, and from the outset, they expected it was going to be about a month. So, I mean, it's a long trial. It's a civil trial, but it's in front of a jury. But in mid-March, of course, we have a global pandemic that shut down the courts. And so everybody went home, including the jury, for 4 months. And I think there was a real question of whether or not this thing was going to end in a mistrial. Ultimately, the Supreme Court in the state of Washington cleared the way for the jurors to come back, and they did so just about a month ago. They heard about 3 more weeks of testimony. They went to deliberate right at the end of July, and in the space of just under 2 days, they reached a verdict, which was they found the state was negligent in the care of the boys, and that negligence was a direct cause in their deaths. And as a result, the jury ordered the state of Washington to pay Susan Powell's parents the sum of roughly $98.5 million.
Wow. So I've wanted to talk to you for over a year because of something you reported in your podcast that has ties to Idaho. And that is the possible location of Susan Powell's body. Talk me through that. Explain how you believe that she might be buried here in Idaho.
There are a lot of pieces that play into this. During the search for Susan, much of the focus was on mines out in Utah's West Desert, based on a comment that Josh Powell had made, and also something that his son Charlie Powell said after his mom disappeared. In the process of our reporting for the Cold Podcast, though, part of what I did was reanalyze any of the intel that I could get my hands on. And that included a set of GPS tracks from Josh Powell's minivan. So what had happened was Josh Powell had, after his wife disappeared, he was interviewed by the police, and they served a search warrant on his minivan. During the time that they had his minivan, he obtained a rental car and he disappeared for 18 hours. During that time, nobody knows to this day where he went. We know that he put 807 miles on that car in the space of just a couple of days. And when he came back on the grid, he was driving south into Utah through Tremonton, and he activated a cell phone there. So the belief is that he was at some location north. You go north of Tremont, you're going to hit Idaho. What I found in reviewing the data from the GPS tracking device the police hid on his minivan the day they served that search warrant was a little tiny blip. Josh Powell, on December 18th of 2009, is driving back to his dad's house in Washington. And he's doing this drive in the middle of the night. And if you zoom really, really close on this data, you can see him make 2 stops on the side of I-84 between Burley and Bliss. The first stop is for about 10 minutes, just on the side of the highway at just before 2 a.m. And then he drives 7 miles to the west, and at the bridge for the Milner-Gooding Canal, he stops again, and he stops there for 5 minutes. So as I look at that data, and then I look at the police records, I see no indication that West Valley City Police ever identified that stop or that they investigated the area around that canal. We can't say why Josh stopped. I mean, it could have been a pit stop, but certainly knowing that this happened 10 days after he disappeared, probably into southern Idaho in this rental car, it's highly suspicious to me that he would make that stop by that canal.
Wow. And of course, you mentioned no sign of Susan Powell since the day she disappeared. Do you think she will ever be found?
It's really hard to say, because I've asked that question to a lot of people who would probably know better than I. I can tell you that the people who loved Susan and loved her boys hold out hope. They do still go out and search when they receive tips that they can act upon. My personal gut feeling is probably 50-50. I've seen stranger things happen decades later where, a hunter, a rockhound, somebody out in the wild stumbles across something. And I think we can all hope and believe that could happen. However, Josh Powell clearly knew that he was under investigation, and by my estimation, went to great lengths to try and dispose of his wife's body in a place where it would not be found, or in a way that it might not be found. So, if she's out somewhere downstream in that canal all these years later, yeah, it would be a long shot, I would think.
And of course, Josh Powell's father, in case he knew anything, passed away. How long ago now?
He did. He died in the summer of 2018 from a heart attack. Steve Powell, interestingly enough, he was a focus of this investigation for quite a long time, because he had what I think many people would consider to be an inappropriate sexual interest in Susan, his own daughter-in-law. One of the things that we uncovered for the Cold Podcast was a recording of Steve Powell telling Susan that he had feelings for her, and Susan rejecting him. Steve Powell ended up in prison for possession of child pornography and voyeurism, because he had been filming underage neighbor girls through the window of a bathroom at their home. And he was visited numerous times while in prison by members of law enforcement, undercover and otherwise, and insisted that he knew nothing about it. Based on everything I've seen, I think it's likely that Josh didn't trust his dad, probably didn't know anything, but you are right. If he had any insight he could have shared, he took it to his grave.
And one of the creepiest parts of the podcast were those songs that Stephen wrote about his daughter-in-law. I mean, just, yeah.
Yeah, this is one of those stories that I think, as you look at the landscape of American crime stories, it will be one that persists for so long because of the oddness and absurdity of some of the people who are involved. Steve Powell believes himself to be a musician who's going to write the song about the city of Seattle, and it's going to make him, rich as a 60-year-old man who can barely hold tune, and he's, plunking out these songs on his, Casio keyboard. It's just so crazy. And then you read these lyrics and you realize, oh my gosh, this man is writing about his daughter-in-law and how he is in love with his daughter-in-law, and he thinks that he's going to sell 1 million copies of this album, putting it out in the world. We can laugh at it because it is so crazy, but then you also have to realize, this was the guy next door, and there are red flags that I think we can take away from some of those behaviors, and hopefully help keep the next Susan from ending up where she did.
Well, and you make that point throughout, that if there are women in similar circumstances, that there is help available, and you do a great job of putting a human face on this. This isn't just some crime down the street, but you get to know the people involved intimately with the Powell family, with Susan. And I've got to ask, how many hours do you think you spent on this?
I couldn't even tell you, Nate. It's I think you have yourself experience working a major story, and you stop watching the clock, because there are so many leads to follow, so many people to talk to. You get sucked down these rabbit holes of investigation, and before it's 2-3 a.m. I couldn't even begin to tell you. I will say that we spent the better part of 3 years piecing the podcast together. We came back with those bonus episodes, like you mentioned, about a year later. I'm still not done. There are aspects to this investigation that remain unresolved. There was an encrypted hard drive that Josh Powell had that's never been cracked, and I know some very smart people who are working on some possible new ways around that problem. And so the clock is still ticking.
And again, it's called Cold. If you're a fan of true crime, even if you're not a fan of true crime, I know several people that really aren't, but got sucked into this story because it's so masterfully told. Cold, you can find it wherever you can get your podcasts. And we should mention that on day one, within the first few days, it did shoot to the top of the podcast charts, which is pretty impressive to premiere something like that. A lot of times the large news organizations in New York or LA or London have those top spots. But Dave, great job. And we appreciate you talking with us. And hopefully maybe there will be some answers one day. I guess we'll see.
Well, and I tell you what, Nate, the key to finding Susan very well could rest in Idaho. And I'll tell you why. During that time when Josh Powell was missing in his rental car, I know for a fact he made a comment later on that he had an interaction with a gas station attendant, and that gas station attendant would remember him. So I have to believe that probably somewhere between Tremonton and Boise, there's somebody out there who saw Josh on that night 10 years ago, and that person has never come forward. So hope reigns.
Wow. So if you're watching, come forward. The name of what's the website, Dave, with all this information, with the evidence and everything?
Yep, just thecoldpodcast.com.
All right. Dave Cawley with KSL, thanks so much.